to start the conversation, I would like us to I would like to invite Cleona Relay to reflect briefly on how AI is affecting the work they do at ACLED, and what does this mean for conflict research, not beyond ACLED, but generally for all of us.
Thanks so much, Tarilla. It's lovely to be here. I, of course, want to support CORN in any way possible. I think it's a wonderful organization, and it's very timely to be discussing this subject. And so I'm happy to engage about how ACLED is using it. So I will start by saying that that ACLED is researcher driven, which means that the conflict data that we collect is not it's not generated. It's also not machine automated. It is, in fact, collected through a number of different means, including our local partners, where we effectively have a catchment of information, and then we review it to make sure that we can systematically engage with it and add it to the data set, so that an event in Paraguay is collected and reviewed and input in the same way that an event in Pakistan would be. And that allows us to have a systematic way of analyzing the events as they occur. And that matters quite a lot, I think, in terms of the additional amount of effort and work that goes into human or researcher-led conflict collection and the quality as a result. So there tends to be an assumption that more is better, and there tends to be an assumption that a more technologically or a more removed, is how I would put it, a removed conflict data collection process is cleaner or less biased. And, you know, we've done a number of different studies about this in the past, and what we find is that both of those things are not true. So if you have a data set, for example, that's using effectively a trawling technique of the internet. So it's automated to the point where it's looking for keywords and it's trawling the internet in order to increase the number of events. What you'll find is that the vast, vast majority, upwards of 98% of that information, is just noise. And it's not accurate information about conflict. So to give you an example, we often find that when we compare the events in, let's say, India, based on a researcher-led data set to one that's had an automatic collection, you'll find that if there's a cricket battle or a cricket match that is described in really emotive terms, that gets recorded as a conflict event in an automated system, when of course it gets ignored by researchers who know what they're talking about. And I use this example in order to illustrate that AI it's a shiny new tool, and there's a likelihood that adopting it wholesale will lead to the same sorts of biased and incorrect conclusions about conflict patterns, and not relying or not having enough trust in ourselves and in our ways of doing things might guide us down a very wrong path and then create disinformation or misinformation, which of course CORN is particularly interested in making sure doesn't happen. So I would say, from my perspective, that one of the only ways to make sure that you are not perpetuating mis and disinformation is by having enormous amounts of human oversight in the information collected, how it's collected, what's collected, how is it being generated, or rather, how is it being kind of incorporated into your work streams, and then how is it being delivered to the public? And given that, I will say that, of course, ACLED is always trying to make efficiencies where it can, and by using technology very thoughtfully. And we do use, for example, we use natural language processing to make sure that, for example, when we want to tag what hundreds of thousands of protests are about, we'll look for keywords in order to do so. And it has to meet a threshold in order to be integrated into the system, but it's also something that's actively reviewed by us. So we use natural language processing quite a bit in the vast amount of information. We have over 5,000 sources that we regularly look at, so it requires some level of natural language processing. We've used some machine learning, especially in the CAST model, which is our predictive model that we've been using. And the machine learning is effectively a way in which we recognize that every conflict environment is heterogeneous, so it has very different ways or very different things that are contributing to the risk within one case versus another. And the machine learning makes sure that we're able to not apply the exact same model that might best predict what's happening in Pakistan to what's happening in Paraguay. And it allows us to do that on a regular basis. And that's quite positive. What we're hoping to do, of course, is to start using far more information for kind of supervised learning. And also, I guess they call it limited memory AI. So not generative, but rather taking our very large either database itself or information on our methodology or analysis, and having a system whereby we can get answers to people very quickly because of the ways it can actually read through our own material quickly, and rather than having a poor analyst have to read through about 50 different methodological documents. And so those are the ways that we are cautiously using AI. And we have been recently engaged at the University of Stanford with one of their computer labs about ways in which we can even extend our sourcing, which of course is done in over 100 languages. So it's quite time consuming, but ways in which we can start using AI to more efficiently do that. But I would like to, I'm always trying to hit the brakes on the old AI and reassert the analysts or the researchers' role in the process. And I think that of course Corn will be doing the same, given its very deep network of excellent researchers. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that reflection. I think what I take from that is really enormous amount of human oversight in the application of AI. Very important. I will move on to, I'll come back to that later, but let me move on to Gillian. And Gillian, welcome. And we would like to hear your reflection also about, you do a lot of evaluations for international organizations, and you do a lot of research that actually inform program design. And I've read out really what generative AI can do in terms of escalation and de-escalation of conflict. Because Accolade has practically shown that when AI sees a football match as combative with emotions, it can code this into escalatory language, leading to decisions that could, if an analyst, if someone would make a decision based on that. So I'd like to hear also, what we would like to hear also, how do you see this in the work in Global Insight?
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here. Forgive the awkward light. It's early. I'm in the US, so it's very early in the morning. Yeah, I should say our organization is filled with both academics and independent researchers. So we sit across this wide area of what you might think of as scholars of peace and conflict. We use all sorts of data, whether it's publicly available, it's online, like Twitter data, and we also use other sources that are already out there, like ACLED, for example. I love ACLED data. And then we gather primary data for our work. It really depends on the project. So the way that we use AI is limited right now. And I have to say that I happen to be someone who's very cautious with it. So the way that we use AI, I would say, is kind of two ways as researchers. And this leads into what I think actually international organizations can use AI for as well. So the first way is that AI allows us to analyze and hold more data than our brains can carry at once. So it's a good tool in that way. That said, we would never, ever run primary data through an open AI situation. The only exception to that might be purely quantitative, completely de-identified data. But we as scholars are used to analyzing our own data. And frankly, I prefer that. So we do kind of a mix. So At times, we'll use what I think of as closed loop AI to do auto coding or to pull out some trending information of qualitative data like interviews, focus groups, transcripts, but that can only happen in a closed environment. And then, so the other way that we use it is AI is really helpful, I think, as a tool, right? Not to replace our work as researchers, but to help us as we move forward. So it can be useful as a first cut for a literature review, throwing in a few different prompts and saying, what comes up? Maybe there's literature that I just don't happen to know about that it will bring forward. And in that case, I can then go to that literature. The other way is, if you're doing quantitative analysis and you're stuck with coding that you're not sure about the syntax around, it's very helpful for that. But at the end of the day, I think, like our ACLED colleagues have mentioned, is that it's really, it remains user-driven, the use of AI with research. And also, important for this are the ways that we do research. Thinking about ethics and confidentiality of data is extremely important, but then also the topics we work on. So this might be something to think about as well with AI. Is not necessarily the use of AI for our work, but our work on our study of the use of AI around mis and disinformation, gendered disinformation. It comes up a lot with violence against female candidates, the use of AI and weapons during conflict, surveillance and authoritarianism, huge topic, never ending. And then finally, we see this increasingly in the US, the deep fakes, and what that means for information sharing, what that means for politics, for campaigns, even something like the pandemic and deep fakes being shared around that. So there's lots to be done in this area, I guess, is my message. But as researchers, we need to be really careful with the way that we use AI as a tool, because first and foremost, our job is to ensure ethical standards and the rightful partnership with research participants. So I'll stop there. I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you very much, Julian. Jake Jake has just joined us. He's joining us all the way from Toronto, so it's quite early there. But I will immediately bring him on board because he's a lawyer and he's worked extensively on the human rights component of AI, and so we'll continue on that track. And Jake, you have done a lot of work on AI adoption and protecting human rights in context of AI. And before we go to the more academic side of things, what can we learn? There's a consensus emerging here that we cannot do away, or we shouldn't do away with AI, but we should apply care. And it's an important tool. But what can we learn? What is the evidence from your work in relation to how AI can be ethically used in ways that don't undermine human rights, especially in conflict areas? Welcome, Jake.
Thank you very much. It's also very early here. It's barely 7 a.m. So bear with me if my brain is still loading. But I just wanted to say this is such a great convening, and I think it's a very timely and very important conversation to have at the moment. I'll first say that no one can avoid AI. It's like electricity, it's like internet, it's now the new everything. It's unfortunately it's very difficult to avoid it. Whether you're prepared for it or not, whether you know it or not, AI systems are being used with or without your knowledge or your consent or your approval. If you have a phone, send an email, you fly on an airport, you walk on certain streets in certain parts of the world, you're already a subject of an AI system. But we already know the benefits, especially when it comes to generative AI. From a legal perspective, there is a lot that we've seen in terms of crunching preparation time for research, for drafting. There's almost a 70% ability for AI systems to analyze large volumes of information when it comes to research on peace and conflict or on law. There's a lot of reviews in terms of due diligence that AI systems can actually help. So they have increased efficiency. They've reduced cost. I mean, arguably, but in some regard, people find AI tools to be quite cheaper. But as a lawyer, we don't necessarily focus on when things are amazing. You know, when people buy their cars, they don't call us and say, "Oh, dear lawyer, I've bought a new car. Come and celebrate with me." No, it's when they hit somebody or when somebody hits them, then they're like, "I'm going to call my lawyer." So as lawyers, we're used to always looking at the risk, the potential biases in generative AI outputs. There's a lot of issues around biased outcomes, biased data sets, data privacy. Security issues, very important. Security issues with a lot of vulnerability to breaches. So I will point out maybe 2 or 3 ethical issues that I think we must consider when implementing or using generative AI tools. And the first, I mean, I could ask them like in form of questions. When I'm using a generative AI tool, what risk can I encounter from this tool? What systems do I have in place to mitigate this risk? Am I trained enough? Are my colleagues trained enough to be able to know just how to apply these tools, no matter how fascinating they are? Something as simple as downloading an AI tool without realizing that you're on the free trial and after 1 month they start charging you. Most of you are very familiar with that. Or whether that AI tool has access to the data on your phone or a cloud that includes data from you, your colleagues, other researchers, name it. So there's enough training that is important that people need to know about the AI tools, about the AI systems, but also trainings to know about the level at which you can trust this generative AI tool, from how it can amplify biases, how it might violate your policies in terms of your research policies, or how it might even endanger the people who you're researching on, right? So what are hallucinations? What happens when an AI tool is hallucinating? Discriminatory outcomes? What mechanisms do you have to flag such outputs? Do you speak to your colleagues? Do you report to the tool? How do you adequately prompt engineer? So in my school, I teach AI and the law to law students. And on week 2, well, this is week 1 of my class, but in week 2, I'll be teaching students about how to prompt engineer large language models. How do they deal with malicious codes? How do they deal with buggy codes and poison data sets? So internally, people should know what and what they could put or not put. Like Julian Foster mentioned, you don't put personal information. You don't put date of birth. People say, but if I put date of birth, how would they know who the person is? I can narrow date of birth down to an individual just by locating the city they live in. Chances are you might be the only person born on 1st November 1944 in your entire city. So it's not as anonymized as you think. Secondly, protecting personal information is very important. What is personal, what is sensitive can differ depending on the kind of research or work that you're doing. When it comes to peace, when it comes to vulnerable communities, a lot of sensitivities are quite critical. You have to think more deeply about, do I have informed consent to be able to use people's data from an AI tool or with an AI tool? And also, if I'm going to share outputs that I've done with an AI tool, should I disclose that? Should I watermark? Should I say this is an AI output or XYZ% of this work is done? But you have to be transparent. You have to be explainable. You have to be able to talk about the tools you used. And lastly, I think there is this, people just talk about AI as if it's just another technology, and it's not. It's not just another software, another app on your phone. Absolutely not. AI systems, and this is me being a bit more academic, more critical, generative AI, they have a lot more expansive or non-apparent costs. For example, the environmental cost from generative AI is something people don't know about. AI tools use a lot of water, a lot of energy to cool their data centers. So are you aware of this environmental dimension? There are also practices that are associated with some socioeconomic harms, like exploitative labor practices. So just checking in if your organization have policies against certain use of certain tools from certain people who are causing havoc to the environment or relying on labor in other parts of the world. And I'll end with this. I think the most important thing is to think about what this AI tool would do in terms of risk of integrity or security of your institution or your platform. There's a lot of tools these days, and a lot of them are not AI, just so you know. Some of them are just statistical, some of them are just analytical, but they don't necessarily use AI tools. I'm not saying a lot of them don't, but you want to ensure that you are addressing what in law we call the FASTA principles. Are you using it fairly, which is F, and equitably? Are you showing accountability in terms of oversight for these AI systems? S, safety and security, ensuring that adequate controls and frameworks are important. Are you transparent? And of course, do you regularly monitor the effect of these tools? I'm not trying to paint a very bleak or negative picture for the use of AI. There's so many amazing ways and needs to use AI. In fact, everyone should use generative AI tools. They're doing really amazing work for a lot of people, but you need to constantly remind ourselves of this risk. So from a legal perspective, I always focus on risks, but I can also talk about the value add.
Thank you very much. I think we're building a good narrative, moving from ACLED to Global Insight, and now to Jake and the work he's doing at Toronto Metropolitan. And now we're going, and Jake has already started this in terms of what he's teaching, and we're going more into the classroom. Florian, you teach students, graduate students, and research methods, but also other courses. How do you use, or what's your view in relation to the use of AI in teaching, especially in relation to peace and conflict research, but also what are the guardrails currently available for students, and what can we do better?
Thanks so much, Tarila, and thanks for the invitation, and such really insightful inputs already from the three previous speakers. I'm learning a lot already. By the way, my kids may run in because the summer holidays are not over here yet. That may be a problem. So how are we teaching our students about the use of AI in peace and conflict studies? I think this is obviously of interest to the core network, just because many of you are also teaching, right? Or many of you possibly are still students. And to me, I think one thing that I've realized over the last sort of 2 years, and also that came up with in conversations with colleagues at various institutions as well, is that I think the initial reaction that universities, at least my university, but also many other universities that I know of, had was one of panic, right? Now all these students are using these tools, right? And basically forbidding the use of them in sort of assignments and university work. And I actually think, in my eyes, that's a huge mistake. Right, and I actually think what Jake and Cleona and Gillian have outlined is really that we have to teach students how to use these tools properly, right, and to know critically interrogate the use of those tools. And I think generalized anxiety and sort of raising generalized anxiety about AI. Which is, I think, something that we have done initially in terms of instructing and teaching students is really unhelpful, right? Because these people, the kids these days, they will use these tools, right? And the tools will use them, right? And so I think we have to find ways to actually teach students. And here in Jake, who's basically teaching a module on this already, be very curious to hear more about that module. We really have to instruct students better in how to use those things effectively. I think to me as an instructor, the truth is this: good students will do very good things with AI if it is effective, and students who are, for various reasons, are trying to use to plagiarize or so forth, they will do that using those tools, right? And so we have to sort of keep on distinguishing between the same students in a way, and enable the ones who want to use the tools to use them effectively, while still staying in control of what they are doing with the data that they are employing. And even if they start with a literature review, right? We all know these examples of, as Jake was already outlining, the AI just makes up some sources, right? And students are just using them, right? Uncritically, right? And I do have to say that I don't yet know, because this is early days, right? I don't yet really know how to teach my students this effectively, right? Beyond what we're all talking about here right now, right? Try to stay in control, because obviously it moves forward very quickly, right? And the urge to use these powerful tools is strong, because people have little time on their hands and other pressures. And many of my students, for instance, they also work to make ends meet, right? And so there is a temptation to take not a shortcut, to make your life a little bit easier by using these tools, right? And these tools can make your life easier, but they can also make your life much more difficult, right? Because you don't know yet how to distinguish those things. And I think me and many of my colleagues do not know yet how to distinguish the good from the bad, right? And so I think coming up with a module, at least in our department, that is the idea, that really helps students make use of those things, without being right away under the suspicion that they are trying to, cheat, right? I think this equation of using AI is cheating is really terrible, right? Again, generalized anxiety is incredibly unhelpful here. Now, from the university perspective, right? Obviously, this is a liability issue. Right, so they approach these things very differently. I'm not a lawyer; I'm a political scientist, right? But I also understand that how those institutions work, right, and what their goal is, right? But I think our goal is still teaching students, right, and teaching students the right use of these tools, and that requires, I think, the exact people that are in this virtual room right now, right? It requires people who really have an understanding of the AI, but it also requires people who are actually collecting data in the field, who are actually doing research work every day and trying to explain that to the students and how that is all done. I cannot sort of resist talking about something else a little bit more, which is that we always seem to equate the use of AI very quickly with quantitative methods, right? I mean, Cleona and Gillian were sort of, obviously the data is much more complex that is used, where especially through AI is also very good in going through what we would, I guess, originally refer to as qualitative data. If you think about speeches, analyzing large text data, right? And I think there's a lot to be done and said about the use of AI in analyzing qualitative data, but that may be collected by researchers themselves, right? If you collect interview data, for instance, but there is research that I and colleagues, Chris Arnold in Birmingham, are sort of at the moment initiating, where we really want to look at how AI and automation can be used to analyze qualitative interview transcripts, for instance, right? Focus group transcripts. So I think there's an efficiency gain here for researchers also in the qualitative sphere. And I actually think in the whole discussion about automation and AI, this whole distinction between qualitative and quantitative data is not that meaningful anyway anymore, because it just becomes information, right? That to some extent needs to be organized by researchers and understood by researchers, but that can be analyzed using artificial intelligence. So again, to just sort of make my two final points, it is that I don't think that in instruction generalized anxiety is helpful. I think it's really about getting experts in the room and explaining to the students how to use this going forward, because students will use those tools because of the incentive system, but also because these tools won't vanish. They won't go away. They're here to stay. It does remind a little bit of, it must have been like this when, Google was first strong and people were just finding articles, and bad students were copying paragraphs and good students were using the information they had at their hands, right? And again, I think there's a lot more to be done about the use of AI in qualitative data analysis. And I'm hoping to do a little bit more about that in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me take this transit with Google, the introduction of Google, and I'll say this is fundamentally different. Different because Google, you have to deal with the material. It wasn't helping you think. AI, in my view, I've tried to use it just preparing for this webinar and also in different areas. I've tried to use it and I've seen where, for example, it fakes references. The AI, in my understanding, wants to help you think. And one of the fears or one of the generalized anxieties, or one of the elements embedded in the generalized anxieties, is really the loss of talent. That practicing writing, for example, You know how to write by writing. You learn how to write by writing. You learn how to think by pouring through this text yourself. When I do field work and I interview 50, 40 people, I don't know, or conduct all this focus group, and I transcribe all of this text myself, I come out knowing about the text, the materials, in ways that giving power or giving this to some other person, or not even AI, a research assistant to translate, will not give me that same knowledge of this text. So it's some of the issues that we think about when what are the limits? What are we losing skills? But I also will also go back and say that maybe this is how people felt when we started typewriting, when we started typewriters, and it's like, oh, people will not know how to have good handwriting anymore. When many years ago, I know in Nigeria, people were taught how to write in schools. They were teaching people how to write. But now we all type on the computer. So maybe this is also the anxiety. I don't know. I will move on to Dr. Okoli from Nnamdi Azikiwe University to reflect on how do you see these teaching students in Nigeria, and what can we learn from, what can we do better, especially because CON is focused on institutions like yours in West Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody from Southeast Nigeria. Thank you, Con, Tarila, and other panelists here, and then of course the participants. I think I want to join other panelists to agree that this convening this webinar is right. There couldn't be a better time. I also believe that such a convening would dovetail into a kind of community of practice and other programming, to build capacity, particularly down here in West Africa. Let me begin by saying that looking at generative AI, let me look at it from, it is important to understand the context in which it operates. For us in West Africa, particularly in Nigeria, where we have, emerging conflicts, and then some of the conflict actors also, misusing AI in ways that intensify the conflict. But then also, that also, shows the responsibility that we have as researchers and as teachers, to guide and to advocate on the proper use of AI. Within the university, for instance, as a teacher, it is also important to understand the context, in which AI is evolving. So here we have students and researchers who are working in hard to reach areas, without much resources, to gather data. So that predispose them sometimes, to negative use of AI, so to say, hard to reach area, poor resources, poor capacity on the demand and the supply side. When I say the demand and the supply side, both the students and the tutors who have, poor capacity. When I say poor capacity in terms of how do we use AI properly. Because I agree with previous discussants that whether we like it or not, AI has come to stay. It is now left for us as human, to put in the checkmates. So one of the challenges that we find as researchers, and particularly, as people teaching young people in the university, the issue of capacity. So many young people do not even know what is right, what is wrong. They do not know the right application to use, and then they are also doing it within the context of wanting to graduate on time, or for young lecturers wanting the idea of publish or perish. So you just have to get the data anyhow, and then this is also happening in the absence or in the context of very few mentors, again, who have capacity to address that. So we are challenged by large number teaming students who need the capacity, but poor number or paucity of mentors. And so I agree with some of our earlier discussants who have said it is important. It all boils down to doing the right thing. And one of the things we are doing down here and in Nnamdi Azikiwe University and other institutes where I am affiliated with, where we teach peace and conflict studies, is to come up with the idea with the TMP, T for teach, that is teach ethical issues, around the use of data, the use of AI in peace and conflict studies. And so when I say ethical issues that revolves around what are the ethical issues you should consider as a student and as a researcher in generating data? And as a researcher, what ethical issues guide you? What are your societal responsibilities? You should understand that as a researcher, you have responsibility towards society. And in the case of peace and conflict researcher, essentially to de-escalate conflict, to inform policy based on empirical evidence that will lead to conflict de-escalation. That is what we, one of our principles in the teaching. And then also your responsibility towards your subject, particularly when peace and conflict research revolves around human subject. How do you ensure that you do not unduly expose them to harm? You do not unduly expose their data. So that is the component of the teaching. And of course, it revolves around generally the basic principles of the Belmont Report, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, in the context of research. The next letter in the principle, the M, when you teach, you don't just teach and let go. You teach, you mentor. You mentor your students around peace and conflict research, to ensure that AI is used in a productive way, not in a destructive way. And then very importantly, even when they're out of sight, physically, you partner with them. We have to partner with our colleagues, with our young colleagues, with our students, to ensure that they continue, to use AI, that they continue to conduct research in ways, that do not, lead to destructive use of AI. So generally what we have done is to evolve, continue to evolve a community of practice where we build capacity, we mentor, and then we partner to ensure that we use AI in ways that enrich our society, despite the challenges that we have. Generally, I agree that generative artificial intelligence have come to stay. It is now left for us, as researchers, to separate the wheat, from the chaff, so to say. And I'm happy that ACLED representative is here. In fact, one of the things, again, we have battled with our students is it is not just enough for you to assess the database of organizations. So you have large volume of data, from ACLED in the organization. In their database, rather. One of the challenges I've had, by the way, I've had over 10 years teaching experience, teaching research method on average of 200 students per year. So roughly in over 10 years, I have taught over 2,000 students research method. And so one of the challenges we have about students, assessing some of these databases, that sometimes they do not understand the principle that guide the data that are there. So you can find out, that in essence, some of the students also abuse the data, even when the database have been properly generated and properly documented. Okay, so that also boils down to the need to deepen conversations like this, and perhaps, a partnership in the area of capacity building to to strengthen the capacity of the supply side, that is the teachers in research method, in peace and conflict, as well as the students. And when you find this data, what does this data mean? Which of these data are in nominal form, so to say? Which of these data are in ordinal form? And how do we ensure that we do not abuse them by doing analysis that ascribe meaning to the data outside what the data really mean? So these are some of the experiences and the challenges, that we need to address. But generally, AI has so many potential. It is now left for us as tutors and as practitioners, when I say practitioners, researchers, to use them in ways that, progressively contribute to evidence-based policy. And I think on the platform of CON, without saying much, I think we are moving in the right direction. And you would agree with me that, very recently, we have started thinking of how to begin to deepen experimental research, which is one area that is lacking, in parts of West Africa, particularly down here, capacity of researchers to engage, in experimental research, in peace and conflict studies. That is another area that we need serious capacity building to ensure that emerging researchers, using experimental design, for peace and conflict studies, do not engage in applying generative AI in ways that, undermine the aim of using this research to inform evidence, to inform policy based on evidence. Let me pause for a while, Tarila.
Thank you very much. You already mentioned ACLED, and this is important because ACLED is very important for CON and also generally for the policy community globally. And one of the things we did recently was to produce the national conflict assessment, some conflict assessment for Nigeria, to inform the actions of the National Peace Committee. CON researchers across Nigeria's 36 states produced a conflict analysis using no other data than ACLED, of course, complemented by interviews and other forms of data. But ACLED was very important, and we're in the process of finalizing that report. And one of the things to ACLED is that while you produce the data and you take all this, and we're partnered with ACLED to train some of our, we've had data analysts for the research project for people who ACLED trained in Abuja together with CON. So there is this benefit that we've derived. Yet, when you provide all the guidelines, once the data is out there, it's out of control of the supplier. So in this case, ACLED. What can we do then, Clona, as a form of responsibility? Do you feel responsible? And just to inform you also that we, in our second training, based on the first one, when we did the follow-up training in Abuja by CON ourselves, and we received applications from different sectors, including people from the intelligence community. And we trained at least 2 people from the Defense Intelligence Agency participated in our training, and these are intelligence analysts. And clearly they have these tools, and beyond. We've given them the data, and therefore it's beyond our control. So what is our responsibility as ACLED, but also as CON? What is the responsibility of research institutions that generate data in providing the ethical guardrails for users of data? That's Claudia. I invite you to reflect on that.
That's a great question, and I want to thank everybody who's contributed here. I've also learned a lot from listening to people's talks on this. So a few colleagues and I recently wrote a paper called Bias in Conflict Research, and it was to take on this notion that data suffer from very obvious biases, let's say under or over reporting, and instead say, there's a lot of actual ways to make sure that, you can limit that. What people should be more worried about is the bias about people's presumptions when they start doing analysis, which is that they're looking for a relationship, or they're using the data without fully understanding what the purpose of those data sets was, just like Professor Okoli has said. And that to me is an enormous problem. And so we have tried to deal with this by saying to people very openly, this is what you can use this for, and this is what you should not use it for, in order to make sure that the lines are very clear. But I take the people's point. When people download, either during an API or they're just consistently downloading, they're not going to be looking for caveats or obstacles to what it is they're looking for. And my worry, and it's a little bit like Florian was mentioned, my worry is that there's this presumption that if you know your way around a data set, you know your way around conflict analysis, which is also not true. And what we've tried to do to counter that is to actually make tools to address people's kind of immediate questions on available to people so that they don't feel like they need to download 2 million events and sort through them and potentially come up with erroneous conclusions, but instead they can ask a very direct question. We, on our end, can make sure that the data that they're looking at is reflective of their question because of the way they've had to filter it. And then the response that they get is something that we can both stand behind, right? But I do also think that we need to also be very cognizant that the data, no matter how it's collected, can be misused if people don't have a particularly, how can I put it, agile approach to conflict analysis, right? If you're looking to confirm your own assumptions or biases, all data will do that for you eventually, depending on how much you kind of nudge it. And the same with qualitative information, it does the same. But if you're genuinely open to what data tell you and the patterns that they tell you, it can become very complex to do so. And you know, as you've noted, Tarilla, you know, ACLED started what we call a data literacy campaign in order to make sure that people were in fact kind of enhancing their use. But that had and it's a very successful campaign. I don't want to say anything negative about it. I'm very happy with it. But it sometimes became us teaching pretty basic research skills to people rather than teaching them about ACLED, which is our specialty. You know, that's our expertise. So so what I would say is that we need to do some thinking really about how to make sure, for example, using AI for something that I call, this is my new pet project, Ask ACLED, which will tell you very directly what these tools we're trying to instill in you. So you could ask, for example, you could ask ACLED, how many locations in Myanmar saw conflict last week? And it would return that information to you. And potentially using generative AI, let's say for visualizations, it could make a graph to display that. But it does so under our parameters rather than parameters that are generated outside the system. So that's probably not a particularly thorough answer, but it's all I have at the moment. I'm sorry, Tarilla.
No, there's no need to be sorry. Thank you very much. What I take from this is really that, and this is why we're having this meeting, it's really a reflection that this is an ongoing reflection and we need to keep thinking. And I think Jake, Florian, Chukuma, Gillian have all referred to this, and that we are reflecting, and it's important that we continue this reflection and to address assumptions that could lead to unintended, undesirable consequences or outcomes. And we, on basis of that, I actually moved one more time to Gillian. If you receive a report or you produce a report, a huge report on say an evaluation of a large scale project in Myanmar, for example, and should you now go back, or should we go back? Should we create a layer that allows us to go back to see, creating a guardrail, so human oversight? Should we, peace and conflict scholars, should we see where, or have a system checking for biases or checking for weaknesses in these reports that could have been as an outcome of the use of generative AI? Basically, how do we check? How do we do a quality assurance on AI informed research that has elements of AI in its method or process?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, you know, it could be done through traditional research methods like sense making workshops. I think this is where qualitative data will come in very handy. Qualitative data, as we all know, is typically more nuanced than quantitative data. It gives us more of the intricacies that we struggle to understand with quantitative or survey data. So, you know, you can check and balance that way. You can do sense making workshops, but then also it would be good to, you know, revisit upon a time, you know, in the future, as you can, in the actual setting where the research is taking place or where data has been collected in the past. Settings change, especially with conflict. But these differences between what quantitative data, qualitative data, what AI versus non-AI generated findings, these differences are really important and actually quite interesting. And it doesn't mean that your research has failed or is bad in some way. It's actually just leading us to more research questions. Why is there a gap? Why is there an unanswered item? That's what I would suggest. Though I would love to hear what others think as well.
Thank you very much. And just as a way, we are 1 hour in. So if you have a question, you can type it on the chat box, and I will ask the panelists. And I think we can continue from what Gillian had just dropped off. But also, Florian, I will ask, as a teacher, how do you deal with works like submitted by students where there's very high percentage of the use of AI and less of the students applying their analytical skills that you have supposedly transferred to them?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I said so many things to think about already that people have mentioned. I find it really fascinating to be here. So I was lucky enough to have not taught for a year because I've been on research leave for a year. But and time moves so quickly that things do change. From what I hear, so this is more like hearsay from what I hear from my colleagues. What they're doing is that, well, it's a bit like, there are some tools that help you, but they're not really that helpful. And really, I think most of the cases that are sort of detected as being faulty are cases that are clearly bad, right? You can kind of tell, like when you know. And that is not a very satisfying approach to it, but it just sort of goes to underline what I said earlier. That is like bad actors, and I think this reflects what Cleona and Gillian just said, right? Like bad actors will do bad things with information, right? And so so what does it mean to be bad, right? Bad could be what Gillian just described, which is just. It's like the most benign type of bad, which is the scientific bad. You sort of fail at something and you're trying to get better, and everything is inference, right? And so that's the normal process of science. And somebody says to you, well, sorry, but you should have actually run the analysis this way, and guess what we're finding now? And you update, right? So that's like the benign type of bad. And then there's the sort of untrained bad, right? Which is mostly where our students sit, I think. So I actually think that they are using the tools at this point, but they're not using them well, right? And then the output is often then just not good enough, right? And it's sort of, but it's not incorporated in a transparent way, also, right? And as we're talking about transparency here as well, and so that may not land them in sort of a disciplinary area, but it does land them, in an area where they don't get a good mark. Right. And that's how I tend to think about it very often as well. Like if it's not obviously an attempt to betray me, then I'm just thinking about this as something where a student hasn't used the tool in a scientific way to make sure that they convey their own analysis and their own thinking. Right. And then there are the bad actors, right? Those that are really trying to maliciously use this information to cheat or to spread false information, and those people, they will always exist, right? They will always exist. I think it's really important to I guess there's still differences to being to plagiarize, in the academic environment, or to just use AI in an uninformed way. I think there are severe differences there. It's not that I have like a go-to answer to like how we should deal with I think time will tell as these tools also will develop, right? As long as these tools are not sufficient, right? So for instance, where Cleona describing this ACLET idea is brilliant, right? I would love for my students to use this, right? Also to understand better how AI can work, like being part of that discussion as well. I think that would be really cool. In the end, right, going a little bit to the point that Gillian was also mentioning, as far as I understand AI, it's still like it's still aggregating information for everyone, right? And so the idea of nuance or however we want to describe qualitative information, right? I don't see yet this is where I fully agree with Jillian, that AI can sort of provide what qualitative analysis by a human being can provide, which is a contextual understanding of what is going on, right? It can provide you some contextual information, but not necessarily the contextual understanding, right? And so the question is then, to what extent you can use AI to make your contextual knowledge better, right, and accurate, right? But I think the understanding still has to be provided by a researcher, because again, as far as I have used AI so far, it basically helps me aggregating massive amounts of information, right? But qualitative information doesn't work that way necessarily. It just sort of is massive, and you make sense of it by understanding, right? Which I just don't see AI being really good at as of yet, right? As I said earlier, I can see an application where AI is used and automation is used to analyze large text data that is produced through interviews or focus groups or videos or drawings by participants and all of these things. I can see an application there, but I think you would always need a researcher to make sense of the context in which this is happening.
Thank you very much, Florian. And I will. There are two questions that I will merge and also reflect briefly. It's really that detection of use of AI. How you detect the use of AI. And someone said here in the text box that they used AI to write a paper or to do a structure of a paper and also guide their writing, and then they also contributed to this writing. But when trying to detect, using again the same AI machine to detect the extent to which they used AI, the machine told them that even areas that they wrote, that they contributed, was written by AI. And so it's really, how do you detect? And I think, in my view, that reflecting on what Florian had said, it's also really that, and what Chukwuma had said, it's really that also the supplier, the teachers need to also understand, also think better in the limit or the limit of the use of AI, and also that know that AI can produce so and so much, but search for something else. So, for example, a better contextual analysis. So when AI, and knowing fully well that it's aggregating data and information, and to what extent this student or this researcher has subjected this data to their own massage, to their own muscles, intellectual muscles, and not just receive what was gotten out from the AI. I think they're probably you need to reflect on the marking schemes or things like that. And Dick is also a teacher. So Dick, how do you deal with this kind of issues also in the classroom? And in among the students, you also know better the machine on the machine end. So it's like, why is AI telling people that what they wrote is written by AI? And how do you deal with all this kind of issues?
Well, I think asking the same AI system if it's hallucinating or if it's correct is, I don't know what metaphor to use to describe that, but I would give a real life case, a real life scenario in the South District of New York. It was a case called Mata versus Avianca, and a lawyer used AI to sort of provide a document, that a legal brief that was going to be submitted to the court. They used ChatGPT. And when the lawyer finished doing that, they asked ChatGPT, "Are you sure that this thing you've provided is correct?" And of course, ChatGPT said, "Yes, absolutely. This is correct." And then the briefs were submitted to the court, and they realized that some of the cases they were not true. And so this lawyer was fined, I think, over $5,000. And it leads me to, in fact, it has led the law profession to think about rules of professional conduct when it comes to ethical guidelines towards the use of machine learning or generative AI systems, for your work. And I think it's important to, before I talk about some of what we are talking about within the legal space, it's important to recognize that for a lot of people, like people who are not very strong with the delivery of English language, AI works brilliantly for them, right? People who don't speak English very well, or it's not their first language. Even if English is your first language, you'll be amazed as to throwing your work through an AI tool, and it helps you correct the language, the syntax, That's great. I find a lot of students can rely on it, right? For me as a teacher, I'm an exception. Most of my colleagues do not want students to use AI because they do not see it as helping the student think creatively, helping the students to use their mind and use the tools for learning. But I'm the one who holds a minority view because I teach AI, I teach law, so I have to talk AI, I have to use AI in my class. And I always talk about the examples in the 1970s and 1980s where mathematicians, math professors, protested publicly against the use of calculators by students. They were saying at the time that if students use calculators, it would hinder their arithmetic or mental calculation skills. And that they also said, there's a big articles I've been reading about how they thought that would weaken students' understanding of mathematical concept. It would limit students' ability to think critically. The same thing is happening now with AI, where people think, oh, if a student uses AI, then they will not be able to, they will not learn the course, they will not be able to produce. I hold a different view because I think AI tools matter. And for me, if a student isn't knowledgeable about the course, they will not even know how to prompt the AI tool properly. So if you don't know the subject matter, how would you know what you're investigating or interrogating? So I ask students to use the AI tools. I want to know what tools they're using. I want to even know their prompts. By your prompt, I can tell you don't even know anything in this area, or you're not doing it in an ethical way. But I'll come back to some of the, before I talk, I'll talk about some of the tools and tactics I use, for example. So I've moved away from just giving 80% or 100% of my classwork to be articles or papers. I do pop quizzes in class. So tear out a piece of paper like you do 15, 20 years ago. Number one question, what's the answer? Number two, true or false, there and then. I also run oral exams where I ask people questions, they respond to me, I give them marks. But I also ask them to go use AI tools to write their work. And in some of these, I make it clear that an AI tool can never, ever do a research for you as a peace and conflict researcher or even as a lawyer. No AI tool can do it like you would. It also does a lot of correlation. It doesn't produce new knowledge. People think it produces, it just combines and combusts and produces something. And also, as you're putting in, it's also using what you're putting in to generate information. So it keeps going, quite limited. But I'll end with talking about some of the duties that we have as researchers when it comes to using AI tools. I think the first duty is about competence. If you don't know how to use it, don't use it because they will catch you, right? I've had a lot of students who use AI tools. And I didn't use AI, but you even left the quotation mark. You even left the summary, the ending summary of what it tells you overall. You use all that thing and you put it there because you don't know that I know better and I can catch you. Of course, it's almost impossible now to decipher if a person used AI. But as a researcher, you have a duty to provide competent information, to provide competent knowledge, to be prepared, to be reasonably knowledgeable about what you're doing and the tools that you're using. The second is about supervision. So when I talked about the case of Marta versus Avianca, when you use an AI tool, if you're my student, I'm not going to fail the AI tool. It will be you I would fail if you didn't adequately disclose or if you use a hallucinated outcome. Same thing with us as researchers. You have that duty of supervision, right? If someone else uses the tool or if you use the tool, we would require that you take responsibility for whatever output comes through. Now, within the legal profession, when a person uses an AI tool, the law will consider that you have used an assistant, a human being. The law would not even consider that you've used a tool. And so the same duty to ensure that you know what your assistant is doing, you're supervising, you have oversight applies to when you use AI systems as well. I think the third is about disclosure and communication about the tools that you're using. You should be able to inform people. If you publish something, inform that you used AI. If you're submitting something, inform that you use AI. My students, when they submit their papers, I have a Google form where they click, did you use AI for this work? Because there's difference between using AI or AI assisting you, there's AI produced, there's AI assisted, there's AI reviewed. I want to know, what did you use and in what parts did you use AI? Sometimes people say they don't use AI, but they realize that they use things like Grammarly, things that correct your punctuations. Those are also AI tools. And I think the last is about confidentiality. And I think I talked about it before. A couple of people have mentioned it. When you're doing research, when it comes to peace and conflict, there are sensibilities involved. There are sides to involve. There are biases that you also hold as well. So things like names, addresses, things like sensitive information generally, you need to understand the dynamics, the data protection, data privacy rubrics that matter to that. And lastly, there is the ethical obligation, even when you don't have bad faith, even when you do it with all good intent, you have the duty and the authority to ensure that everything you're using is of accurate product. So whatever information, even if you share it, there's a current case now. I don't know if you know, TikTok was sued a couple of weeks ago over a challenge on social media, and TikTok was saying that, well, they're just a platform. They did not allow encourage anybody to do any challenge. But the law says, well, I'm sorry, if your platform is that platform people carry out these challenges and you publish it or you promote it, then you take responsibility. So if you're an organization, a school, a university, a research network, and you publish work that is AI generated and has false information or libelous or discriminatory or slanderous information, you owe the expansion of that duty of care touches you as well. So I know I'm not trying to hamper down again on like, oh, these are, don't use it, but use it with transparency, accountability, with learning, with candor, with a duty of responsibility, duty of disclosure, and of course, ensuring that adequate data protection is applied where necessary.
Thank you very much, Jake. I think you also answered the question that followed. Somebody had asked about using AI to correct their English, and you clearly stated that that's acceptable, and to the extent that you declared that, in fact, people use Grammarly without declaring. Nobody tells you to declare when you use Grammarly. So I think that's clear. Finally, Chukuma, it's in all of this, how can we help? How can we help researchers in Nigeria, for example? How can we help researchers adapt to the changing landscape of AI, of technology? Not to be, because one of the practical issues is that many years ago, I remember that one of the issues about decolonization, one debate about decolonization was that, well, these quantitative methods, these complex quantitative methods that lead to publications in Journal of Peace Research and all these major US journals, clearly excludes researchers in Africa, in West Africa. But AI is now telling you maybe you have a chance. So, what can be done as we, as CON, we reflect and we come together to think about ethical application of AI? What can be done? How can we help researchers and take advantage of this room and panel? What can be done to improve the capacity of both the supply side in terms of researchers and teachers, and the demand side in terms of the students in using generative AI ethically?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tarila. First, as I've said, we need to understand the environment in which our students and the tutors, work in an environment, of weak resources, hard to reach areas and hard to reach persons. So for instance, I've had vast experience conducting surveys in Nigeria, getting respondents, especially when it has to do with elite interview, very difficult. I'm just trying to lay background on factors that may predispose our students and perhaps younger colleagues to use AI in negative ways or to plagiarize. So hard to reach areas they can get data, hard to reach people, elites, especially in positions of authority in government, or are not willing to grant interviews. Weak resources. Students don't have resources. Many of the research are done out of pocket in an environment of growing poverty. So we need to understand that this is the context in which the students work. But how do we? So when we understand this context, we put mechanisms in place to to encourage ethical use of AI, and to preempt abuse. And one of the things that we do to preempt this is first of all, one of the things like I've started doing as a supervisor, a mentor, and a teacher is to emphasize on the idea of depth over breadth. So you are doing a research in peace and conflict. So you want to study the whole of Nigeria, but you don't have the resources. You don't even have the capacity to manage the data. Like if we go back to ACLED again, to get the data and properly analyze them. Why don't you just focus on a very small incident within your locality where we can easily, get the data, understand the data, and manage this data properly? So that's on the one side. So emphasize the issue of depth over breadth for students and perhaps for organizations. And then secondly, to participate, participatory teaching, participatory mentorship. So most times for beginning researchers, for my students, I don't just allow them go collect the data, deal with the data alone. I get involved in design. So, and I also encourage, teachers to do that, get involved. So even in the classwork that I do, that's a whole lot of work. I try to group them in manageable groups, get involved in the data collection processes, whether they're using AI or other primary data. You get involved so that, you can know where they are intentionally or unintentionally, because sometimes they abuse, this AI unwittingly, so know where they are intentionally or unintentionally. I have to participate, and I encourage colleagues to do that in data collection, data management, and all that. So when you participate in that, you're able to provide the necessary mentor. And then more importantly, I try to encourage students and colleagues to build partnership. So many organizations working on issues of conflict, like, many of my students, I ask them, get engaged with the activities of CON, and many other organizations for which I've had opportunity to serve as a consultant or a researcher. I think also that, one of our partner organizations next year is also, doing some work in the area of collecting data. So we should partner with organizations that have opportunity or potential of building our capacity as the supply side, so there should be emphasis on the train the trainer, technique, so that university teachers will have opportunity of getting some form of lateral internship, some form of partnership, some form of train to trainer support in the area of data usage. Because most times I read through some works of some students, you see that they have collected data, they have run some analysis and all that, but in the whole, if you look at it and weigh it on a balance, it comes to nothing, because in the first instance they never understood the data they used, so they applied wrong statistics in analyzing the data that should not be subjected to that. And interestingly, they get results, and they use it to make analysis. Okay, so there is strong need for partnership with universities, between many think tanks, and not-for-profit organizations in Nigeria are already doing well, but this need to trickle down through partnership, into the university. And then very importantly, both universities and think tanks should develop, data policy. Develop data policy. That way you should bring to the knowledge of the students, because sometimes, as I said, some of these things are done unwittingly because of a knowledge gap. So when we develop data policy, we make it public, and also, the students and the users, become aware of this. Then they can also, in one way or the other, seek capacity. So these are, very little ways, through which I think we can deepen ethical use of AI generated, data on AI generally in the area of peace and conflict research. Yeah, thank you, Tarila.
Thank you very much. We've come almost to the end of this. If you have a question, please put it in the box. And if you want to speak, also you can indicate by raising your hands on the app if if you feel more comfortable with that. But without further ado, I would say that this is a reflection process for Conflict Research Network West Africa, and we're taking all of this into account in building, enriching a draft guidance note that we already have. And at the end, we expect to have a guidance note on how CON and its members will use generative AI in peace and conflict research. We hope that others will benefit from this because we have already benefited a lot from hearing people speak. It's important that we reflect and we think, and we do not take for granted the practices, the everyday practices of research, but also the everyday change that we see in the field, either in methods or in communication of research. Having said that, I will provide one more, give the panelists one more opportunity to give a pattern word, give their pattern words to this room. Fiona, what should we go home with after listening to you, and what are you taking home or to your colleagues at ACLED?
Oh, thanks very much. That's a great question. Sorry, I've moved. So, so given the conversation here, I think that we should take up the initiative, as mentioned by a few people here, to try to have a better discussion, I think, about good data use and what that involves, what we can try to enhance. Because I took Florian's point very seriously that the vast majority of people who might unintentionally use something could be led in a different direction, of course, and then the bad actors are kind of beyond our control at the moment. But there's a lot of people, I think, eager to see how to incorporate this without doing so in a way that increases their bias or limits their engagement with local communities, which I think we are all invested in. And so I will happily take any suggestions if people have them about how ACLED can help that initiative. And it's something that we really do want to move forward with, as we're not going to get away from it. AI is not going to be gone next year. So we've got to make our peace with it and figure out how it can work for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clina. Florian, you're going back to the classroom. You just returned back from leave. What are you taking from this, and also what do you think that's important for us to take into account as we move forward with this draft guidance note?
Yeah, I think concrete applications, right? And I think to help those people, I really think that the really bad actors, they're just such a, in the distribution, they're just such a tail end, right? And the ones that are not really looking at this in a trained fashion, they are massive. And so finding an application that is sort of intuitive for people, especially in conflict research. And if you think about what Cleona just outlined in terms of, or today, what she outlined in terms of ACLED, I think that would be really cool to guide people through this. Yeah, having really direct applications that are intuitive in terms of what people are working on. The other thing is really that I think I can only say what Cleona just said. It doesn't go away. It won't go away, right? And so it's something to be dealt with. And the idea that we are dealing with it by outlawing it. Jake was saying this too, that his colleague don't really want it in the classroom, but that's not life, right? It's like my children going to the nursery and they still have like a phone with a dial, with a dial that works like this, and they don't understand what that is, right? But the nursery still has it as a toy. But I don't think the real world works like this, right? That's wishful thinking. So I think we have to sort of get real and acknowledge that the real world. For these 17, 18-year-olds that start university, at least in our case, how the real world will look like when they come out of the university, and it will include artificial intelligence, right? And so telling them that they cannot use it is not the solution.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. how do we help people use it? Gillian, your final words to us, and also what you're taking home back to Global Insight.
Yes, thank you so much. It was really lovely to share the time with everyone today. I think I agree with the other panelists and those that have questions or comments as well throughout that we should think of AI as a tool. AI itself is learning and growing. And I think if we can learn and grow alongside it, then we are better off for doing so. We can't ignore the reality that AI is here, and I don't think we are going back in time since then. So we may as well embrace and understand and try to harness this as a tool. And then also highlighting and laying bare where the tool itself has gaps, limitations, biases, and keeping our work human-centered, as in about humans, for humans, led by humans, I think is really quite important. Thank you so much.
Thank you. About humans, for humans, and led by humans. Chukuma, one more chance to share what you're taking home and what we can do better.
Yeah, thank you once again, Tarila, panelists and the other participants for sharing your time with us, for listening and for the questions. My take, home, my takeaway is that AI has come and it is growing. So we should embrace it in ways that leads to development. And to do that is to understand the weaknesses or the gaps of AI. Therein lies our responsibilities as researchers and as tutors and as students, particularly in the area of peace and conflict research. If we understand our responsibilities to address this gap, then we can use AI in profitable ways. That makes things easier for us. I think also, and one way to do that, the ideas that change the world always begin in a room, Tarila. I think that, this conversation should, move on. We could think of a multi-stakeholder grouping, where, we can see how to, especially for our students and tutors in Africa, how do we build their capacity? This is very important. How do we build partnership, build capacity, support, and then mentor and monitor over time to ensure that, the database that are churned out, by organizations like ACLED are utilized in ways that do not, lead to misconstruction of the data. And one way to do that is, to enable capacity building through such stakeholder convening, through such mentorship, and through such partnership. And for tutors out there, I think that this is time to also engage more in the student supervision in the area of data collection. So we don't just allow the students go collect the data and analyze it. It's important to be ahead of the students in understanding this database, participate in data collection, participate in data analysis. That way we'll build a better society in developing AI for our use. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is not the end of this conversation. We have a guardrail, we have a guidance note we're developing, and the conversations here will feed into that guidance note. We have a draft, but obviously with the conversations here today, we will improve on that draft. What we are foreseeing is a kind of a network of institutions, a network of research institutions, researchers signing up to the ethical guidelines and accepting ways of using. There are possibly those kind of guidelines existing for corporate organizations out there, but I think CON is well positioned to produce that kind of guideline and share with organizations and partners that will also sign up and use this guideline to support their work. We know, for example, I see that Professor Cyril Obi of the African Peace Building Network is also here, and we hope that this will influence some of the work that they do at APN. We know Nextia is also here in Nigeria. We also know some colleagues from CDD are also here. And therefore, CDD, by the way, has a very big fact-checking network. And we will continue these conversations with all the partners after we have finished developing the concept note, the guidance note, which will come up. Very important also is that for us, it's important that it's one of the key points that emerge from this conversation, which you take home, is not to deny AI, but rather to integrate it in your teaching and to, especially for research methods, so as to be able to address the issues and build capacity around it, and so that it doesn't it doesn't go into the black market. Let me put it that way, but rather it's in a regulated market where people can interact with it and account for it. Without further ado, I would say thank you very much for your participation today, and thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the colleagues online. We had at some point 52 participants, so quite interesting gathering, and many people were interested in this. We had participants from the United States, from Europe, from Mexico, from Ghana, South Africa, Namibia, Kenya, Nigeria, and around West Africa. So indeed, we're reaching a lot of people, and we will also disseminate the final report to all the participants. And we're not going to help you in your work, in your teaching, and in your studies. And then also for organizations like Accolade, that it will help you also in shaping how you do your work also. We're very happy to partner with you. Thank you for all the support, Glenda. And Julia, we look forward to partnering with you in the future. And again, thank you very much. And thank you for everything. Have a beautiful afternoon or morning, wherever you are in the world. Cheers.
Thank you, Trilla and Takorn. Lovely to meet
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.